Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn Eisen, and I am going to divide our topic of Christians and Roman Society gender into two lectures for this week. The first lecture is going to be something of the social context of women in late antiquity, and then the second lecture will focus on the three different texts that I have asked you to read for this week. So there's the New Testament texts, some passages from the Gospel, and from the letters of Paul and letters attributed to Paul, a chapter by Rodney Stark, and also some primary sources, particularly and most importantly, the Acts of Tekla. So let's talk about women in late antiquity. Our goals for this week are to consider Stark's arguments regarding women and early Christian growth. What is it about Christianity as a formative movement that was appealing to women? And we are also to consider what the Tekla text teaches about values of early Christians regarding women. So those are our goals, our learning goals for this week. So let's get going. So as I shared with you last week in class, when we talked about the Perpetua and Felicitas text, there are ways of understanding gender that were unique to the classical world. And we have inherited these views of gender. And two views of gender are very much shaped by the philosophers Plato and Aristotle. Excuse me. And again, we have inherited these views, so they might seem ridiculous to you, but when we think more deeply about them and think as we're looking around and seeing how people understand gender and behave towards people of different gender identities, we can still see some of these views present in the 21st century. So one view is the Platonic view, and Plato believed that identity of an individual came from their soul, not from their body. Plato believed that the soul was placed in a body based on the character of the soul. So, for example, if you had a strong soul, then that would be placed in a strong body. And for Plato, that was a masculine body. On the other hand, if you had a weak soul, that would be placed in a weak body, which for Plato was a feminine body. However, Plato did believe that a female could become male through the process of education or development or growth. We see this in the Perpetua and Felicitas text, where the text tells us in one of her visions, quote, "My clothes were stripped off and suddenly I was a man." Okay, we read this and we discussed this, how this view of gender is meant to signal to the reader that Perpetua is actually a very honorable woman. But because you don't have language for that, the only way you can really express how honorable or courageous or strong a woman is to describe her as male. And so this is where we get the term in antiquity of female man of God. Okay, so a man of God obviously is a term for someone who is a man, specifically, is considered a very righteous individual. And so a female man of God is a woman who is a, considerably righteous individual. So to many of us today, this would be a very insulting thing. But it's meant in antiquity as a compliment. And so it's important that we understand it within its own context. On the other hand, we have an Aristotelian view of gender in Greek philosophy. And for Aristotle, you have a difference. For Aristotle, the soul and the body were linked. Okay? The female body was inferior to the male body, hence women were inferior. According to Aristotle, a woman cannot become superior like a male because, like, a woman can't become superior like a man because she is already an inferior being. She's a failed male or a deformed male. Okay. And so this is shaped by Aristotle's understanding of biology, which argues that a fetus, the gender of a fetus is determined by the amount of warmth that to which a fetus is exposed. So if during gestation, if the fetus receives enough warmth, then the genitals will fully develop and will descend from the body. But if the fetus does not receive enough warmth, then the genitalia will remain inside the body and an inferior fetus or a woman. Okay? So we've actually seen some of this attitude already in a text that we read, the Gospel according to Mary, in which we read, Peter, you are always angry. Now I see you disputing with this woman like the adversaries. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you then for your part to cast her aside? In Peter's view, she is inferior, okay? And they have to argue on behalf of Mary as being worthy or being a legitimate source of information, okay? So these are two views of women in antiquity that we're going to see inform and shape the texts that we read. So let's talk a little bit about girls and women in the Roman world. So a Roman household was a collective. It was a unit. We've seen how important kin is as a social value. And a Roman household was a collective over which the father, the paterfamilias, had dominion. And he had dominion over not just his wife, but his children and also his slaves. Slaves were part of the household as property, as were women. Now, there were some exceptions to the issue of authority over women with respect to wealthy women. So if you were a woman of wealth, you had greater chance for having autonomy in society than a woman without wealth, which is, of course, true today as well. In the early Roman Empire, the legal standing of daughters differed very little from sons. Girls were educated to a certain degree up until a certain age. We can see in this image here on the right, this young woman is clearly sitting and reading, although what she would have been reading has broken off of this small statue. And also here we can see these young girls are playing a game. So we know that young women did enjoy some aspects of fair play and education up to a certain age. But the primary education of women was, of course, in household tasks, spinning and weaving. And some women, as we have seen, like Perpetua, had access to education and that included reading and writing. Some women were authors and poets, and we do have some remnants of that. The paterfamilias, or the father, had a right and a duty to find a husband for his daughter. First marriages were normally arranged. The age of consent was 12 for girls. It was 14 for boys. And in general, noble women married younger than women of lower orders. And not everyone was legally allowed to marry anyway. Roman women married in their teens or their early 20s. They were, of course, expected to be a virgin. They could refuse a match that was made if they really objected to it, but only by showing that the proposed husband was actually of a bad character, right? So if you disputed the honor of the person to whom you were to marry, then you could successfully avoid that match. The bride was subject to her husband's authority, but she also remained unchanged in her relationship to her father. So her father always had primary authority over her. Okay, so she didn't escape his authority by moving to a different household. She simply gained an additional authoritative figure over her. Marriage was very simple. It was the sharing of bread and the sharing of the bed. And widows were held in esteem, but women were also expected to marry again if their husbands died or divorced them. Some women did have occupations. This woman here is functioning as a midwife, one of the rare pictures that we have. Not a picture, it's a carving actually. And also women did enjoy sport to certain degrees. This is one of my favorite mosaics. Actually, I love this. Here we have, up here, look at this. We have these little weights, a medicine ball. Here these women are playing a game, and for the life of me, I don't know what this is. This woman has won something, right? Maybe this is beach volleyball. I don't know. And here we have an image of a marital ceremony. This is the extent of it. Clasping of hands, and then the sharing of bread and the bed. And here we have a model Roman couple. Roman husbands were expected to treat their wives with kindness and with gentility. And any evidence of this was allegedly displayed in the birth of children that were considered problematic in terms of the way they looked or the way they behaved. That was a sign of a bad marriage. Okay, we're going to pause at this point, and you have just been introduced to women in late antiquity. And from this point, I am going to stop, and I will create a second lecture here that you can listen to at your leisure to address the passages that I have asked you to read for this week.